good morning, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be able to chat with you all this morning and try to pull this together here. My name's Abby Pfisterer. I'm our Senior Education Specialist at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. My work is mainly with students and teachers in those formal classroom education settings. I was thrilled to be able to hear a few of the questions you all were asking Grace. And I noticed there was at least one about how do you work with students. So this talk will be a lot about that, but certainly other things too that can be applicable to more than just a student audience. Like I said, though, my work is mostly with teachers and students. And specifically, while I work across museum education practice, I really focus on how do we leverage history and museum content to help young people become more civically engaged with their communities, with their local neighborhoods, and also really with our larger democracy. It's been an interesting year to work in that capacity, certainly with all of the political changing landscapes that have been taking place here in our nation, but also across the world. So I'm happy to share what we've been up to over the last year. Certainly honored to be talking with you all. I know that everyone who's here in this meeting will have so many other really interesting experiences to share that we can learn from. So I'm hoping at the end, if you're comfortable, I'd love to learn from you as well. By no means are we the experts. As you'll see, we're figuring this out as we go. But thank you for letting me come in and chat with you all today. This is really an honor. Okay, like I said, I'll be talking about museum education in a changing virtual world. And for students in particular, museum education, as you know, it's such a critical tool for helping students learn to understand our world, past, present, and future. How can we use the past to imagine the future? It helps them contextualize current events and helps put everything in perspective as much as we can. And we provide places for cross-experiential learning. So at the American History Museum, we really prioritize how do we help students engage with people they wouldn't otherwise have a chance to. So how could we connect students in one part of the country to another, and then to students around the world too, so that they're learning from both shared and differing experiences. But now that we are in this virtual world, we really had to grapple with how can we continue to teach and do this work when our artifacts are immovable and can no longer be viewed in person? How do we engage with audiences when their needs are completely different now? And also, how do we switch to virtual? Because that's not what we were really good at before we started this past year. And like I said, we're still learning. So we're not experts at this work and we're learning as we go. But what we are experts at is, like all of you, is helping people use history and use museums to find solace, to build community, and to understand current events. So I'll be talking about these assets mostly rather than our deficits. I'll be talking about how we leveraged what we're really good at to address the audience's needs as best we can. And like I said, we didn't always hit the mark. It's been a learning process, and we're still in that process. But it matters that we continue to do this work, especially as we are in this constantly changing social, political, and public health landscape. And on that note, I certainly hope you all are safe and healthy, and I hope you and your families are doing really well as well. And on that note, also, I hope this can be a conversation. I've got lots of examples to share, but I also encourage you to stop me at any point, ask questions. Please tell me if I'm going too fast, if something wasn't clear. I'm more than happy to stop and address any concerns, questions, comments you all have. So please feel free to use the chat as much as you'd like. And so I'm going to be talking about, to use such a corny word, but our journey over the past year of how we've been reaching students and teachers. But like I said, this can apply to other audiences as well. And I'm hoping at the end, like I said, you'll share some of your big takeaways from this last year as well. So I'm curious, actually, though, to get started. For those of you whose museums are looking at engaging student and teacher audiences, have been doing so, are any of you facing certain challenges? I'd love to see if you share in the chat, what challenges have you been facing as you try to work with this audience?
Abby, can I interrupt you? We're still on
Please.
the first slide. I don't know if you're not in
That's okay.
presentation mode. Okay.
No, it's supposed to be on the first slide.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure in
Yeah.
case you wanted to. Okay, perfect.
Yeah. I'll go on to the next one here in just a moment. And if you have things on your mind as you go, please just feel free to pop them in the chat. So, go back in time a year. In March of 2020, that's when things started shutting down for us here in the States. Schools closed. We all started doing our work remotely, as many of you faced, and certainly earlier too. So we had to really consider, how do we continue to do our work, but also what is the nature of the work that we needed to be doing in this new environment. So rather than trying to continue doing what we'd been doing before with object talks, with field trips to the museum, we decided we could cram all of that and try to repurpose it into a virtual world. Or what we could do was reimagine what we should be doing, knowing full well that our audience's needs had completely changed, right? So you can see in the images here, we used to welcome people to the museum, like I said, cross experiential moments, looking at artifacts face on. And now we're working in such a distance place that, particularly for students, this has been incredibly challenging. They have limited time in which they can engage with museum content. Teachers are struggling to make sure that they have their lesson plans up and ready, that they're addressing learners' needs of different abilities and different challenges. So we knew that our same old practice just wouldn't be applicable in this new world. And this talk's really going to be about how do we flip it and take an entirely new approach to what museum education for school audiences could be. So I'll talk about not only that approach, but I'll talk about the content that we featured and some of our digital tools as well.
Abby, would it be possible to see your presentation
Oh,
in full?
sure. Yeah.
That would
Let
be
me
great,
see.
just to make it a little bit bigger for folks. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. Now you're going to see me look down a little bit at my notes. I hope that's okay. I had them on the screen, but this is totally fine. Okay. So one of the things we started by doing was taking an honest assessment, like I said, of our audience's needs. We really wanted to make sure that we stopped doing the stuff that was no longer relevant, and really sped up the things that could be more useful. So the week we had school shut down in mid-March, I was scheduled to go visit 2 different school districts to lead in-person teacher professional development training on how to integrate museum practices into classroom settings. So of course, no one was traveling. And also that sort of stuff, while important, wasn't the priority. Teachers can use that practice of how do you integrate object-based learning and object analysis into your classroom. But suddenly that just wasn't as important as helping teachers simply facilitate lesson plans, providing them with content that they might not have access to all of a sudden. So we had to put on the brakes for our original plans. We said no more professional development, at least until this summer when schools are on break and we can reassess how to do that. And instead, we flipped over to what you see on the right side of the screen, which are distance learning lesson plans. And so we immediately started developing almost 40 different lesson plans that teachers could pick up and plug right in for their students. They were lesson plans ready to go about different topics we knew that they were teaching at that time. So we built lesson plans for elementary, middle, and high school students, our 3 different grade bands. And again, this was just so we could provide them something that they could plug and play, no questions or no thinking really, and allow them a little bit more time and flexibility to plan other aspects. So it was the best we could do at that moment to be as helpful as possible for our teachers and for the students that they were working with. We also, there we go. We also decided to start creating content with the lowest possible barriers to entry. And I heard a little bit of what the conversation was, your questions with Grace. It sounds like she talked a little bit about webcasts. We took a similar approach. We wanted to start providing content that people could access really easily, and provide them a form in which they could talk to us and ask questions and tell us what they wanted. Previously, our practice had been to do listening sessions where we would talk to teachers, talk to students, ask them what they were interested in, ask them what they needed, and that would help us think about the best possible programming that we could provide. But we just weren't able to do that anymore. No one had time to talk to us, and that's okay. So instead, we just started doing what we thought might be the best possible thing. And that was starting with both those distance learning lesson plans, but also webcasts about different topics in social studies, in history and civics, in geography and economics, that a teacher could use both to have their students watch and learn a little bit using museum collections, but also so that they could ask us questions and tell us where we could do a little bit more for them. So we were trying to be as accessible as possible to these audiences. It didn't always work. One of the things we learned really quickly is that people didn't have time to tune into a live audience broadcast. So while our prepackaged distance learning lesson plans were really successful because people could use them as they wanted, it didn't really make sense to have people schedule to come and watch a 30-minute webcast in the afternoon once a week. We had a few people show up and they would ask questions, but we realized really quickly that teachers and students, we couldn't possibly find a good time each week or each month where a lot of people could come together at once and engage in these live webcasts or live discussions. So while it was really easy to get there and low barriers to entry is something we learned and continue to facilitate into our programs, live programming wasn't our best option at that moment. And I'll share an example in a little bit where we're figuring out how to do it. But for this audience in particular, they wanted things that were prepackaged that they could do with how they wanted to, and not necessarily needing an opportunity to talk to us directly. So it's a big flip from what we were used to before, where we'd have teachers want to have us come talk to their students and want to talk to us and ask questions. It just wasn't something that fit within what they needed at that moment. Now, another thing we really started thinking about, and for us at the American History Museum, this was something new to talk about what's happening right now. Our content at the museum focuses on American history, different communities, different moments in history, different eras. We're not always comfortable using that to talk about current events. We've tried it in the past. It's made some people nervous. And so this was a moment, though, where we realized if we're not using history to help our students better understand what was going on around them, then we're missing a big opportunity and we're not serving them as best as we possibly can. So in May of last year, we launched something called Viral Histories. And this was the start of a series of programs in which we used history to examine not only the pandemic, but also how the pandemic has been impacting different communities around the United States. So we started by talking about the impact of the pandemic on Asian American communities, because with some of the political rhetoric around about a year ago, we saw a spike in hate crimes and intolerance towards Asian Americans because some people inaccurately blamed them for the pandemic. We wanted to use our national platform, very trustworthy, able to reach a lot of people, to help combat that intolerance and that hate, especially for student audiences who otherwise might not really have an opportunity to think critically about the news that they were seeing. So we launched Viral Histories. Again, we're thinking about the content that we were using and also our approach. So learning from our initial webcasts, we decided to create prepackaged videos. You can see those in the upper right-hand corner. So every day for a week, we dropped a 10-minute video with people on the front lines of the pandemic, either in hospitals, fighting hate crimes in communities, doing different things on the front line. And we just let them talk for 10 minutes to talk about what's going on. And then in the afternoon, we had a webcast with our curators, with local students, and with other experts to contextualize those videos with history and to bring in historical examples. And again, provide an opportunity for people to talk directly with us. This time, what we found was that the videos were really well received. We had thousands of people tune in to watch them every morning when they dropped on Facebook. And then we saw just as many people join us in the afternoon because it was a content and a topic that they wanted and needed to talk about. And I'm just going to pause for a minute because I see there might be a question in the chat, and I'm more than happy to pause and take that.
It's a participant who is presenting herself.
Oh, I see. Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So this was one approach we found that worked really well, being really blunt in saying something's happening around us and we have an obligation and a responsibility to talk about it and to help students understand that they're not always, that it's hard to always see everything that's going on, but that history can give you a tool to better understand. And we also found that once we can, oh, go ahead.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I'm curious whether or not in the afternoon sessions where you perhaps had a curator, was there an object from the collection that they used, or what was the relationship to the museum and its collection, or was it really just that the museum is a safe space for dialogue?
It's a great question, Liz. Thank you. It was both. So we really wanted to leverage that we were a safe space for dialogue. Museums are, at least in the United States, consistently regarded as one of the most trustworthy sources of information, more than news, more than researchers. So we knew that we really had the ability to help people take a nonpartisan view on current events. So we wanted to create a forum that was safe, trusted, and particularly because that's what teachers are looking for. They're trying to help their students find places to find honest information, real facts, and help them parse through some of the misinformation they've been hearing. We also, though, to get at the other aspect of what Liz asked, we included with this historic content that we would show throughout the webcast. So just like now, we'd have a screencast up, and then as the curator was talking, we had a producer, usually me or someone else on the back end, who could flip screens and then show an object. So our curator for one of these stories, for example, talked about some of the exclusionary practices towards Chinese Americans that took place in the 1920s. And so while he was talking, I showed some of the artifacts from that so that it gave a visual reference, and then he could talk directly about those objects and talk about how there's been anti-Asian sentiment in the United States for more than just this pandemic, and then use that as a way to help contextualize what was going on and help people find perhaps solutions or ways of thinking to be more tolerant and to be more inclusive of our communities. Does that help, Liz?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very helpful.
That's a good question. So this was a big changing point for us to really think about, okay, it's time to be, right in our space to talk about current events, and the fact that video was going to clearly be one of our most effective tools. So this took place in May. Again, I'm working with students and teachers, and we know that, schools are out for the summer, and especially in 2020, most schools ended a little bit early. So after this, we really took a break. Hang on here. We stopped doing what we do for just a minute, and we spent the summer planning. Normally we do programs over the summer to help students when they're outside of school time, but we decided to not try to do too much, to try to do what we're doing really, really well. So Kermit the Frog, the puppet you see here, he's in the collection at the American History Museum. He was a bit of our inspiration for the summer to work as hard as we can, to stay focused, and then relaunch in the fall. So over the summer, though, one thing we did do was we started up our teacher professional development programs again in a much lighter form. We used to do programs that took place either for a half day or sometimes 2 full days. This time we offered an hour here and there, and we collaborated with some of our other Smithsonian museums. So we wanted to make sure we were still available, but we weren't trying to do too much, knowing that we couldn't do everything and knowing that our audience just didn't need us to do everything too. Do what we can, do it really well. That was our motto. And then in the fall, when we came back, we really leveraged what we had learned over the spring and what we've been examining over the summer. And we used this for what is our biggest event of the year. It's called the National Youth Summit. So every year, the National Youth Summit is something that we do in the fall. It's for teenage students. It's there to help them have conversations about moments in history that are tied directly to events today. Now, I know that's something we're new at doing. It used to be where we would say, this is, for example, the National Youth Summit on the Great Depression. It would be tied directly into something that happened in the past. This year, though, learning from what we'd seen with viral histories, we flipped it and we talked directly about what was going on currently and then used history to underpin a couple of conversations. So in September of 2020, we hosted the National Youth Summit on Teen Resistance to Systemic Racism. So we had massive protests across the country last summer about systemic racism. They continue today. And we wanted to make sure that teens across the country had a safe platform again to be able to talk about what they saw going on every day, about not only the protests, but also the racism that they might see in their own communities and on the news. And then to provide them with some history that could help them understand how we've gotten to where we are today and provide them with places to discuss that with teens that they may or may not get to spend time with in their everyday lives. So the history we used to underpin this, it was the story of a woman named Claudette Colvin. She was a teenager who was one of the first people to take an active resistance against segregation in the southern part of the nation in the 1950s. So we were able to share a story of a 15-year-old, and we told this to 15-year-olds. And it became this really powerful moment in which they could see themselves in history, and feel like they were being welcomed to talk about what they saw. For a lot of educators that we work with, we know that's an uncomfortable thing to do, to talk about current events, especially when they might have a partisan bent to them or feel like they are political or controversial in nature. And so we felt it was our responsibility to provide them a safe way to have those conversations and to really point out that history and today are interconnected and that we have to be engaging students in those conversations. Now, this one has always been a little bit of a virtual program, but we went all virtual, of course, in 2020. So the National Youth Summit had been going for 7 years now. Mostly we do it every year. Some years we take a year off. But we've always used this as an opportunity to share a live webcast of students, scholars, curators talking about history and then connecting to today. Usually, these used to be a 1 hour long webcast where students would tune in and then have discussions through a chat with us and with each other. But we just learned throughout the whole year that asking someone to come to us for a 1 hour block to watch something live, it's just not possible right now. It might not be possible going forward again. So we completely flipped the model. What we decided to do was to break it into 15-minute chunks. We made these pre-recorded videos instead of a live streamed event, and we shared it out with teachers several weeks in advance. So we asked people to come together in discussion on September 22nd, but we shared all of the videos, all of the historic content, discussion guides, everything they could possibly need to be ready for that discussion. We shared it with teachers on September 1st so that it became this really long experience. Rather than a 1 hour live experience, people joined us over the course of a month as they watched the videos, as they prepared and thought about history, and as they read through some discussion prompts. And then on September 22nd, we did do a live stream. We showed all of the pre-recorded videos during 1 hour and said, if you want to join us during this hour, great. And if you can't, that's okay too. But we were really overwhelmed because what happened was we had almost 3,000 students show up and join us in this live streamed event. And what we found, and as we talked to students later on, was that they were able to be there for a number of reasons. First, the topic mattered. They really cared about it. They didn't necessarily care about the history, but they found the history useful. What they cared about is that we were talking about something that mattered to them right now and used history to help them understand it. And their teachers felt the same way. So the teachers made sure that the students were able to get there or that they knew about this. They also were able to show up because we gave them such lead time. We said, we're going to give you all these videos and things to think about a month in advance. And so they had a month to plan around this and to make sure they were there. And we also featured students. So you can see in the upper left corner, we had a student speaking with the head of the Smithsonian, Secretary Lonnie Bunch. And to them, that was kind of a must see. They really wanted to see teens come out and be talking on a national platform with some of the leading scholars around the country. So these things together, it got teens excited. And so when we saw we had about 3,000 teens showing up, we saw this through the platform we were using. We were streaming it through Vimeo. We were ready. We were ready to facilitate a discussion with them. So while the live stream was playing, we had educators and curators chatting with them. So Vimeo has a chat function, just like so many other video platforms. And we had a conversation with them. And so they were able to really ask questions of the students who were watching, facilitate their responses when they came back in. And it seemed really seamless as we were going through this, but it took a lot of preparation. It took us about 6 months to pull this whole thing together. Normally the summit takes us a whole year to plan, but in some ways going virtual made it a little bit easier because there was only so much we could do. You know, when it's in person, we could do too many things. So our options were limited. We figured out ways to facilitate conversation, and I'm happy to go into those details if you want me to. But we facilitated this chat for those who were there live. And then for those who couldn't show up live, they could watch the videos whenever they wanted. We encouraged them to host their own discussions over Zoom or whatever platform they used. And then we provided everybody with what you see in the lower right-hand corner, a Padlet. So using Google's Padlet platform, where anybody can log in and write anything they want, it's a completely public platform. We asked people to share their responses, share their reflections to what they were thinking or what they'd learned. And so we had this really interesting space in which anyone who participated, either live or asynchronously, could come and tell us what they thought or share with others. And then others could come back on the site and react to that. So we were able to open up a little bit more conversation where students could keep talking to each other through the Padlet. And I'll just pause for a second. I know the summit's kind of this complicated program, and I just want to make sure that was clear, or if anyone had questions. So I'll pause.
We have a question from the Tumanian Museum. I'll read in Armenian. Ինչպես եք կանխատեսում լսարանի թվային մասշտաբը, ինչպես եք վերլուծում արկա մասնակցության հետ եւ ինչ նշանակություն ունի ձեզ համար թեման եւ դրան հաղորդակից եղած լսարանի վերլուծությունը?
So I hear, what is the digital scale and what is the relevance of this topic? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So in total, the National Youth Summit reached about 4,500 students nationwide, the 3,000 that joined us live. And then we have record of about 1,500 more participating asynchronously. We also might not know necessarily if more people showed up. So I'll mention that we asked people to register for this event. We don't normally ask people to register for live or live streamed webcasts, but this time we did. And the main reason was that we wanted to keep students safe in this virtual platform. Not only are these young people, minors, having conversations, they're talking about a topic that had a lot of political pent-up aggression and energy around it. And we wanted to make sure that we didn't have people coming in and saying hateful or hostile things to these students and causing them harm. Because we'd seen other times where live stream events that talked about systemic racism did have people come in and say very hateful things. So we asked people to register so that we could control access a little bit, just to make sure that you couldn't just show up and say something terrible, which in some ways we think actually limited the scale of the program. We think it could have been a little bit bigger if we hadn't required registration. But we ended up, like I said, with 4,500 students. The impact we saw through both the Padlet responses where students reflected, but also we did a survey of both students and teachers who participated. And what we found was that, and I don't have the percentages right here in front of me, but most students, and I believe the percentage was 87%, said that this event shaped the way that they view current events. I think it's 92% of teachers said that this provided them with really important tools for teaching both history and current events in their classroom. So for everything we asked them, we saw at minimum an 85% success rate of impact, both on their understanding of today, but also how they think about history and the usefulness that history can provide for them as they think about current events and also imagine the future. So we found it to be a really successful event. It's showed more successful response than National Youth Summits had in the past. So it's something that we'll keep going on with this in the future. We think this model of being bold in the topic, really encouraging live participation and finding something that students care about. Those seem like no-brainers, but they've just become something that will become our pillars for program development going forward. And for me as a museum educator and for my colleagues too, I know we felt in a way liberated to be able to talk about these things. It's not something our museum's done a lot of in the past. We always talk about doing this, but we just hadn't done it. And so being able to do this and try it out and see that it could be effective, we all breathed a little bit of a relief to say, okay, this worked and we can try this again and push the boundaries of what we as a history museum are allowed to do. I see there's two more questions.
Yes, you can read the last one in English. Thanks, Abby. I wanted to know more about how you tackled the BLM movement with a non-partisan based approach. Were school teachers involved and were there certain lessons cultivated from any challenges faced you can kindly share with us?
Sure. Yeah, it's not an easy topic to take a nonpartisan approach. When you think about it, we realized that if we thought about talking about the Black Lives Matter movement directly as a news event, it would be nearly impossible to not anger people on one side or another because the emotions and the experiences are so deeply entrenched. So what we did instead was talked about those larger concepts around the movement, justice and representation. And we found that those don't have a partisan bent to them. If we can talk about moments where people fought for justice in history, which is what the teenager Claudette Colvin did in 1955, that's something we can all agree on, is that people deserve equality, that they deserve justice. And we had to make the decision that if someone disagreed with that people don't deserve equality and don't deserve justice, there's just nothing we can do about that. They're not the people we're necessarily trying to reach, and we're not going to let them come in and share that message of hate because our message, we had to decide that our message is that we fight for justice and equality. And when we went back to some of our senior leadership at the museum to say, this is what we're doing, we're not going to tolerate someone who says people should be treated unfairly or should be faced with systemic racism. Of course, our senior leadership said, that's what you should do. We should not tolerate that kind of speech. So we had to take our own moment and decide that we stand on the side of justice, which again seems like such a normal thing to do, but we really had to state it. And that allowed us to say, anyone who does not agree with this, you're not allowed in this program. And we found that we'd never ran into that either. Perhaps it was the registration requirement, but also just the framing of it, that we're talking about a powerful concept and we're talking about it through the lens of history. We never had to kick anyone out or to even tell people to be careful with their language. It just seemed to work out a little bit. But we did set guidelines from the very beginning of every live discussion. We had really strict, what information about what language would be tolerated. Anything hateful, we said you'd be immediately removed. And we asked people to come to it with a willingness to be open to learn from others. And so that helped too. But of course, this is different than working with a public audience. School students who are talking with their teachers, might have a different mindset than an adult who's been watching different types of news. So I freely admit that this audience might be a little bit more easy to work with than others might be. But the challenges that we faced, we mitigated a lot through intense advanced planning. Like I said, those guidelines we put for discussion. I worked really closely with the Smithsonian's security experts, cybersecurity experts, and privacy experts to make sure that we were protecting students. And I can happily share some of these resources. They're in English, but I'll share them with Liz and with Lauren to share with you all, so you can hopefully modify them and use them on your own. Those seem to help. The biggest challenge, though, I would say just came from moderating some of these topics because there were so many people that wanted to talk about them. But we had a big team. We had about 8 people moderating, and that helped us work with it. And yes, we did work with school teachers in the planning. We worked with one of our local school districts. So we're based in DC, of course. One of the largest school districts in the country is located just across the state border here in Virginia, where I live. We worked with Fairfax County Public Schools. And so they were able to provide us with several school teachers who joined the planning to think about how this topic could be presented and then received by students of lots of different lived experiences. So yes, we couldn't have figured it out without school teachers really helping us think it through.
Thank you very much. There is one question from Marine asking about which of your programs that you've done throughout the year you would say was the most successful, and how could you describe a bit more and share?
Yeah, so I actually think this one was the National Youth Summit, but this is a once-a-year event. It's our biggest one. I can't say, so I'll share another one actually after this too, that I think has also been really successful. But let me share one more thing about the summit that I think is part of why I thought it was such a strong program, is that not only did we have live and asynchronous participation, we also worked really closely with partner museums around the country. So our work is usually focused on a national audience. Sometimes we talk to our local DC audiences, but usually it's national focused. So we worked with affiliated museums around the country. So I think we partnered with 15 other museums who could take the program content and repackage it, redesign it for the students that are in their local community, because they know them better than we ever could. They know how their students might respond. They know how to connect with them, how to facilitate discussions. And so collaborations were really important for this work so that we could not only serve this national audience, but also some smaller communities as well. And the other part of that was we were working on a very virtual type of program, but of course there are so many students that don't have access to the internet on a regular basis. These local museums that we worked with, they were able to think about some either low tech or no tech options that could work for their students. So I think this program was really successful because it came at it from a lot of different access points. Collaborations were really important, and just the boldness of the project too. But let me share to your other point, a different program that I found to be really successful in a totally different way. Another project we've been doing is called Vote History. And Vote History, we designed very much in response to our challenging political landscape, especially this last year. So this project was all about how do you read between the lines of political speeches? How do you learn to sort fact from fiction and really listen to what a politician is saying and decide if it's true or not, or if you agree with it or not? So many young people are forming their political identity, and we wanted to use history to help them understand what it means to be part of the democracy that we have. And so we started with speeches. So we created distance learning lesson plans that walked them through different types of political speeches. And I'll show you the platform that we used for this in just a moment, but it combined lesson plans, objects, and self-guided learning experiences for students. And I think it's successful because it provided students a way to learn in a totally different way than the National Youth Summit did. There's nothing live about it. And we saw that these distance learning plans had about double the participation than we saw of some of our other work earlier on in the pandemic. So again, right at what was going on in the current news cycle, really giving students tools that used history to understand today, but letting them do it on their own time and pace. Let me pause because I see another question here.
Thank you. Yes, there is one from Gevorg Orbelian. He's asking, he's also working in a historical museum, and having in mind that the USA is a multicultural country, what kind of community-based programs you have done or make the implementation through education?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Thank you for asking that. A lot of our work at least at our museum, at the American History Museum, to implement community-based programs has been through these partnerships with other museums around the country. Like I said, I know a lot about what's going on in the Virginia school districts and the DC school districts because they're right here in our local area, but I know very little about what's going on in other parts, specifically in different communities around the country, but museums in those locations certainly do. So we've been partnering with other museums so that we're sharing the workload. Together we can come up with ideas and concepts, and then I can help implement that for our local community, and they can implement that for their own community. So partnerships have become really important to make sure we're being effective in our work, because we don't want to create something and say it's one size fits all. We know that's not true. Like you said, we have so many cultures here, so many traditions, so many communities. Like all countries, we have so many learners that have different needs. So we're very much humble to say we don't know everything, but we want to work with those other organizations who might know more about those communities. I will admit, prior to the pandemic, we were working really closely with our local school district in Washington, D.C. to create experiences that were really about the local history and to help them engage with it by either coming to the museum or us going into their classrooms. Obviously, that we had to pause those sorts of in-person interactions when we had the shutdowns take place, and we haven't picked it back up as much as we would have liked to. We decided to shift our focus to this national implementation rather than local community. It's something I wish we had more time to do, but we're planning to work again on that this summer. Back to that Kermit the Frog puppet going really fast on his keyboard. That's our work this summer, is to think about local community.
We have a comment from the Hovannes Թումանյան Museum. I'll read in Armenian. Եթե թեման նոր է ձեզ համար, աննախադեպ է, ինչպես նշեցիք, ինչ-որ չափանիշ կամ ձևաչափ, ինչպես եք ընտրում նախագիծը իրականացնելու համար։ Հայաստանում տաքարյուն են եւ նման վիճելի թեմաները կարող են դուրս գալ ցանկացած ձևաչափից։ Սա շատ գործածական կարող է լինել մեզ մոտ, բայց ձևաչափի ընտրության հարցը կարծես թե բարդ է։
It's a very apt question, thinking about both the format and the topic for the program. It's tough right now to think about the topic. I'll take that aspect of the question first. I know it's hard to say because the political landscape here has certainly been really contentious, to the point of violence in the past month and certainly in the past year. And we were really cautious in deciding to address systemic racism and also political rhetoric through a historical lens. I feel really fortunate that the senior leadership at our museum wants us to tackle these things and is willing to shoulder any blowback that we might get. But it was really scary, to be honest, when we opened up live conversations about systemic racism. I was really nervous that I was going to have to kick people out, shut down the conversation. My whole job during that live experience with the National Youth Summit, um, while I was the project director, when we actually went live, the only thing I did was sit and watch the chats in different platforms so that I could be ready to shut things down if I needed to. And it was really intense just waiting for someone to come in and say something intolerant or hateful, like you mentioned. I'm feel lucky that nobody came in, but also I know that because we put such stringent kind of blocks on who could access the program, we minimized the risk that we were taking there. But it is a risk to open yourself up to talk about these topics. And so in some cases, it's, we can, rather than with this Vote History project, really talk about, well, some politicians are lying to you right now. We talked about historical speeches instead. We never once in this Vote History project talked about what was going on today. We just talked about history and let the learners make those connections on their own to go, wait a minute, I'm hearing political speeches today too. This is really similar. But because it was such a touchy topic and still is, we never directly said it with the political rhetoric projects. I agree, it's scary to do that. And we weren't sure if we'd necessarily get the support we needed or if we'd be opening ourselves up to something really bad. So we were bolder with the summit with racism than we were with political rhetoric. So we're always kind of gauging the national agenda, the national mood, and how angry people are to determine how intense we can possibly be and where we need to scale it back. But I also, the format is something that we've been considering carefully. Like I said, we don't always get it right. Those initial webcasts, they're good, and we're still doing them, but they don't get a lot of viewership, and so we're not so sure it's something we'll continue doing. But what we found to be a continuing thing that seems to work for us is what can we create that's either a pre-recorded video or a distance learning lesson plan that people can implement on their own time. We've really decided to stick to prioritizing live programming once or twice a year. It's just, we have found that our audience is unable or unwilling to join us for more than that. So lowering our expectations for what the audience can do and also lowering our expectations for what we should be doing. Did that answer your question? I'm hoping I didn't divert too much.
I think it was perfect.
Okay, thanks. It looks like, are there other questions?
Everyone is thanking you.
Oh, okay. Okay, sounds good. Well, let me share I want us to actually circle back to that initial webcast I was talking about at the beginning, and I just mentioned again. So the webcast that I talked about at the very beginning, like I said, we're still doing it. We do it every other week now. It's a 30-minute webcast where we feature museum objects and we feature a curator or a museum expert talking about that. But instead of really relying on this as our, everyday solid programming, we're using it as a place to experiment. So every month we try something different, whether we break the topic up differently, whether we play different maybe games or have a different type of conversation. We're seeing what might stick and then going forward with what does and dropping what's not working. So it's a really low impact project for us to do. It doesn't take a lot of time for us to pull each of these together. The webcasts are 30 minutes. It takes me about 30 minutes to organize them. So it's been a really interesting place for us to kind of think through what's going on with our audience, to kind of empathize with them. And then also, define what we should be doing, test some things out, and then reflect. So that iterative process has been really helpful. And the last thing I wanted to share, these were just a couple takeaways. We've learned to be really compassionate with our timing, not asking people to do too much. We're trying as best we can, either directly or indirectly, to take on current topics. We're collaborating with a lot of other organizations. Lots of access points, lots of ways to participate. And we're experimenting a lot as we learn and do things well and not so well. I also wanted to share this website. You very well may already be familiar with the Smithsonian's Learning Lab. You can see the URL here on the screen. This is something we use all the time. It's free. It's a website in which you can access over 4 million Smithsonian objects, but you can also upload images and information about your own. And this is what we use to create distance learning plans. So this that you see here on the screen, this is an example of Learning Lab. So it is designed to be English and Spanish primarily, but you can type in it in the Armenian language. You can translate through there. So it might take a little bit of work, but we found it to be an effective tool for showcasing objects, creating lesson plans, and it's a pretty user-friendly tool for the student or the teacher on the back end. So I just wanted to share it as a free tool that could work. And yeah, that's what I have. So I'm happy to answer more questions, but I also would love to hear what you all are working on as well.